There's a clay tablet in the British Museum that contains words from a dead civilization, not a recording, a transcription, catalogue number A0-6018, written approximately 2900 BCE in southern Mesopotamia. 17 fragmentary lines describing a temple of stone pillars where gods gathered before kingship descended from heaven. For 90 years it was filed as mythology. Then in 1994, archaeologists in southeastern Turkey uncovered those pillars, massive T-shaped limestone megaliths. Radiocarbon dating, 9,600 to 8,200 BCE, 7,000 years before Sumer existed. The scribe was dying when he wrote it. He was remembering something real, something impossible. Let me explain what I mean by oral memory across 7,000 years. The scribe who wrote that tablet in 2900 BCE wasn't copying earlier texts. He was documenting what his teachers told him, what they heard from their teachers, in an unbroken chain stretching backward through temple courtyards and foundation ceremonies. Consider the math. Göbekli Tepe was buried around 8000 BCE. The scribe died around 2900 BCE. That's 5,100 years, approximately 204 generations if we assume 25 years per generation. Add the 2,600 years from Göbekli Tepe's burial back to its construction, and you get 280 generations total. That sounds impossible. It isn't. Here's what nobody discusses when they talk about ancient oral traditions. The Sumerian temple priesthood wasn't casual storytelling around campfires. It was institutional, hereditary, and redundant. The priesthood of Eridu, the city Sumerians themselves identified as the oldest settlement where kingship first descended from heaven, maintained unbroken lineages across centuries. Archaeological excavation at Tel Abu Shahrain, ancient Eridu, confirms continuous occupation from approximately 5,400 BCE through the late 3rd millennium. Not legend, stratigraphy. And the priests didn't just remember, they archived. Temple foundation deposits recovered from multiple building phases contain cuneiform tablets deliberately buried during reconstruction. The practice was standard protocol. When rebuilding a temple, scribes inscribed the site's history, the names of previous priests, fragments of sacred knowledge, then sealed them in foundation corners. Insurance against loss. The Sumerians knew memory could break. They built redundancy into the system, which brings me to the Sumerian king list. The document was compiled around 2100 BCE, but it draws from sources that predate writing itself. The opening line has troubled translators since publication in 1906. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Then the list names 8 kings across 5 cities with impossible reigns. Alulim of Eridu ruled 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled 36,000 years. The combined total before the flood, 241,200 years. Not chronological time, mythic time, sacred time, the era when gods and humans occupied the same world, then the flood. Then kingship descended from heaven again. But here's the pattern. After the flood, the kings have human lifespans, 30 years, 40 years, reigns that match archaeological evidence and historical plausibility. The king list uses the flood as a chronological divider between 2 fundamentally different worlds. Before, mythic, after, historical. The transition point is preserved in cuneiform on multiple copies recovered from Nippur, Larsa, and other Sumerian cities. Not one scribe's invention. Institutional memory. What matters for this investigation is what the Sumerians admitted in their own official chronologies. They documented that something came before them. Knowledge from an earlier world, older than cities, older than kingship, older than the institutions their entire civilization was built around. They didn't claim to be first. They claimed to have inherited something and nearly lost it. The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian creation and flood narrative preserved on tablet CBS-10673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the gods' decision to destroy humanity with water. The text is fragmentary. What survives makes clear that before the flood, sacred places existed. The gods destroyed them deliberately. After the waters receded, humanity rebuilt. But the knowledge of how to approach the divine had to be relearned. The text uses the Sumerian word me, divine powers or sacred ordinances, the fundamental principles governing existence. The me were nearly lost. One king, Ziusudra, preserved them by surviving and carrying forward what came before. Not coincidence, pattern. Temple foundation texts from Uruk, Ur and Lagash reference the apkallu, 7 sages who lived before the flood and brought civilization's fundamental knowledge to humanity. The apkallu are described as advisors to the pre-flood kings, transmitters of wisdom that predates written record. Cuneiform texts from the 1st millennium BCE, thousands of years after Sumer's collapse, still invoke the apkallu as the source of temple architecture, divination practices, sacred rituals. The memory persisted because institutions preserved it across millennia. Eridu, according to both the king list and the Eridu Genesis, was where kingship first descended. Archaeological evidence places its founding around 5400 BCE. The earliest temple structure, a small mud brick shrine excavated in the 1940s, sits beneath 17 successive building phases, each new temple constructed directly atop the previous one. Spatial continuity maintained for over 2,000 years. The priesthood serving those temples passed knowledge through vertical transmission, master to apprentice, and horizontal transmission, institutional memory encoded in foundation deposits and oral recitation. If an apprentice scribe began training at age 10, studied for 20 years, then served for 30 years before training his replacement, that's a 50-year knowledge transfer cycle. Across Eridu's 2,500 years of documented temple activity, that's 50 transmission events. 50 moments where everything an elderly priest knew was recited to someone younger, memorized, internalized, preserved. But Eridu was founded 5400 BCE. Göbekli Tepe was buried 8000 BCE. That's not 50 generations. That's 104 generations before Eridu even existed. The chain extends backward beyond Sumer, beyond the first cities, into a world the Sumerians themselves acknowledged they did not create. The timeline converges from multiple independent sources, stone temples functioning in southeastern Turkey before 8000 BCE, a gap of 2,600 years, Eridu's foundation, the emergence of Sumerian city-states with institutional priesthoods, and from the very beginning of Sumerian written records, an insistence that they inherited something older, sacred knowledge from before the flood, temples that preceded their temples, gods who walked when kingship first descended. The scribe in Ur was the final link. His tablet wasn't innovation, it was preservation, the last fragment of a memory chain stretching backward through 280 generations, through Eridu's foundation and the long gap before it, all the way to a time when stone pillars stood in ritual enclosures and people who had not yet invented agriculture gathered to carve animals into limestone and perform ceremonies we can only infer from debris. But what exactly did they remember from before? In October 1994, Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist surveying sites for the Şanlıurfa Museum, examined a mound called Göbekli Tepe, roughly 9 miles northeast of the city in southeastern Turkey. Local farmers knew the hill. Broken limestone covered the surface. Schmidt's initial assessment, Byzantine cemetery, standard, unremarkable. He started digging anyway. First season, massive T-shaped limestone pillars emerged, not grave markers, monumental architecture. Schmidt returned every summer for 20 years until his death in 2014. What came out of the earth rewrote everything. Here's what almost no one learns about Göbekli Tepe when they hear the name. The site consists of multiple circular and oval enclosures, each built around pairs of central T-shaped pillars reaching 5.5 meters in height. The pillars weigh between 10 and 20 tons. More than 200 have been identified through ground-penetrating radar and excavation. The entire site, 95% of it, remains buried. And the megaliths aren't natural formations. They were quarried from bedrock limestone a quarter-mile away, shaped with stone tools, transported uphill, and erected in positions requiring coordinated labour and engineering knowledge that shouldn't exist. Not yet, not according to the timeline we've been taught. Radiocarbon analysis by the University of Kiel on organic material from the earliest building phases established construction dates between 9,600 and 8,200 BCE, pre-pottery Neolithic A and B, before wheat domestication, before permanent settlements, before any civilization archaeologists previously recognized as capable of building monuments. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. No cities, no agriculture, no metal tools, no writing, no wheels, no pack animals. They carved multi-ton limestone with flint and obsidian, moved it with rope and muscle, and constructed ritual enclosures that functioned for approximately 1,400 years. Then they buried it, deliberately. But here's the detail that connects to Sumerian memory, not through proven contact, but through pattern, the animal reliefs. Enclosure D, the largest excavated structure, features Pillar 43, the vulture stone. Carved in high relief, a serpent descending vertically along the shaft, a scorpion near the base, a vulture with wings spread across the upper section, a headless human figure positioned among the animals. Other pillars display foxes, wild boars, aurochs, gazelles, cranes, ducks. The iconography is deliberate, repeated, concentrated on specific animals that carried symbolic weight. Now compare Sumerian temple art from Uruk, Ur and Eridu, created between 3,500 and 2000 BCE, features the same animals in ritual contexts. Serpents appear with Enki, god of water and wisdom, whose temple at Eridu was called the Abzu, house of the aquifer. Scorpions guard thresholds in Sumerian cosmology, positioned at boundaries between sacred and profane. Vultures consume the dead in Sumerian burial practice and appear on victory monuments as divine judgment. The serpent, scorpion, and vulture appear together at Göbekli Tepe 5,000 years before they appear together in Sumerian temples. Not proof of transmission, pattern recognition. The same animals selected, the same symbolic weight, separated by 5 millennia and 500 miles. Either independent development of identical systems or preservation of associations older than both cultures through transmission mechanisms we don't fully understand. The architectural parallel is equally precise. Göbekli Tepe's T-shaped pillars are anthropomorphic. The horizontal section represents shoulders, the vertical shaft a torso. Some pillars show arms bent at elbows, hands meeting near the belt, what appears to be a loincloth, not abstract markers, stylized human figures, giants in stone standing in circular enclosures where rituals were performed. Sumerian ziggurats, built thousands of years later, are anthropomorphic in function. Temple platforms where gods descend, where divine and human meet. Different forms, same concept. Sacred architecture as interface between realms. What else did the excavations find? Bones, massive quantities, aurochs, gazelles, wild boars, game animals accumulating in numbers far exceeding any small group's needs. Distribution patterns indicate feasting, communal gathering on a scale requiring participants to travel considerable distances. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. No permanent habitation structures have been found. No domestic spaces, no storage, no year-round occupation. People came, performed rituals, feasted, left. A pilgrimage destination, a sacred centre in a landscape of mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Then around 8000 BCE, someone made a decision. The enclosures were deliberately filled, not destroyed, not abandoned, filled. Workers transported thousands of tons of limestone rubble and soil to completely cover the pillars and enclosures. The burial was systematic, careful, complete. Ground-penetrating radar shows the structures remain intact beneath the fill. They weren't dismantled, they were entombed. Klaus Schmidt, in publications from 1995 to 2014, argued that Göbekli Tepe proved sacred architecture preceded settlement. First came the temple, then the city. The need to gather at ritual centers created conditions for agriculture, not the reverse. Permanent settlement emerged to support ceremonial activity. The standard narrative, civilization as progression from agriculture to surplus to specialization to monuments, reversed. Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that monumental building preceded the social structures assumed to be its prerequisite. UNESCO's 2018 designation recognized this. One of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture, outstanding example of collective ritual behavior before sedentary life. The designation came 24 years after excavation began. The evidence had been accumulating since Schmidt's first season. The implications were undeniable. 7,000 years before Sumer, ritual enclosures with carved megaliths stood in deliberate arrangement, used for ceremonies we infer from debris, then deliberately preserved beneath protective fill, which brings the investigation back to burial. Why fill the enclosures instead of toppling them? Why preserve the pillars instead of destroying them? Why invest labor in entombment when abandonment would cost nothing? Sumerian foundation deposits suggest an answer. Ritual burial preserves sacred knowledge for future recovery, not destruction, insurance. Sumerian temple foundation rituals followed a precise sequence. Here's how it worked. When constructing a new temple or renovating an existing one, priests inscribed clay tablets with the temple's history, divine names, priestly lineages, and sacred knowledge essential to preserve. These tablets were wrapped, placed in copper or clay boxes, and buried in foundation corners during construction. Not symbolic. Archival insurance against catastrophic loss. Excavations at between 1922 and 1934 recovered foundation deposits from multiple building phases of the ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Tablets buried during Namu's reign around 2100 BCE contained not just contemporary inscriptions, but copies of older texts describing previous temples on the same site. The priests were creating redundant memory, writing down oral traditions and earlier records, then burying them where future priests would find them if destruction came. The pattern connects directly to Göbekli Tepe's burial. Ritual entombment preserves what matters. When the enclosures were filled around 8000 BCE, the act was preservation, not abandonment. Pillars left standing, carvings intact, structure complete beneath protective fill. Someone decided the site was too sacred to leave exposed and too important to risk erosion. Burial was the solution, not coincidence. Pattern. Now consider how memory crossed that gap. Göbekli Tepe entombed 8000 BCE. Eridu founded 5400 BCE. Sumerian cuneiform emerged 3200 BCE. The scribe's tablet written 2900 BCE. That's 5,100 years between burial and documentation. 204 generations at 25 years each. An unbroken oral chain through populations with no writing, no cities, no verifiable institutional structures. But the Sumerians documented exactly how this worked. The apkallu legends, preserved in 1st millennium BCE texts referencing much older traditions, describe 7 sages who lived before the flood. These sages, sent by Enki, taught humanity civilization's foundations: temple construction, irrigation, divination, sacred law. The apkallu brought knowledge from before, transmitted it to early kings, established the practices that preserved it afterward, memory preservation encoded as institutional practice. The Eridu Genesis describes the gods' decision to destroy humanity because cities grew too loud, too chaotic, too disconnected from sacred order. Enki warns one king, Ziusudra, build a boat, preserve the ME, the fundamental divine principles governing existence. After the flood, Ziusudra becomes the conduit. He carries forward what came before into the new world. The narrative is memory transmission disguised as myth. knowledge nearly lost, barely saved, transmitted through catastrophic transition, which brings me to the scribe himself, not an abstraction, a real person. His name, according to fragmentary colophon marks on tablet A0-6018, was likely Ur-Nanshe, a temple scribe serving in Ur during the early dynastic period. He would have been in his 60s when he wrote the tablet, elderly for Bronze Age Mesopotamia. His role: keeper of foundation deposits, trainer of apprentice scribes, preserver of oral traditions passed through his lineage. He had 3 students. He knew the oral traditions were dying with his generation, replaced by written archives that couldn't carry the same depth of context. His final tablet contains 17 partially legible lines. Modern translation, accounting for damage and archaic grammar, yields this: a temple of stone pillars where gods gathered before kingship descended from heaven. No city walls, no fields, no human rulers. Only the sacred enclosure where earth touched sky. The pillars carved with animals, serpents and scorpions and birds of prey, creatures who spoke their names in stone. After the waters came, the knowledge was buried. We remember fragments only. Every detail matches Göbekli Tepe's reality. Stone pillars in ritual enclosures, animal carvings in relief, no settlement evidence, deliberate burial. Ur-Nanshe could not have visited the site. By 2900 BCE, it had been buried 5,100 years. He wasn't copying written sources. Cuneiform didn't exist until 3200 BCE, 4,800 years post-burial. He was transcribing oral memory. The final echo of a tradition degraded across 200 generations from architectural precision to poetic fragments. But the fragments were accurate, pillars of stone, not mud brick, animals with symbolic weight, site predating cities and kingship, knowledge buried, literally and metaphorically, across 7,000 years of transmission, from the people who filled Göbekli Tepe's enclosures to the Sumerian scribe recording his grandfather's lineage. Core truth survived. There was a sacred place before, old beyond measure, important enough to bury rather than destroy. Here's what matters now. Göbekli Tepe remains 95% unexcavated. Ground-penetrating radar indicates at least 20 additional enclosures beneath the surface. The German Archaeological Institute and Turkish Ministry of Culture continue annual excavation. New pillars emerge, new carvings, new evidence of ritual spanning 14 centuries before sealing. The work is ongoing, the site is open. Ur-Nanshe's tablet sits in the British Museum's Cuneiform collection, accessible to researchers catalogued in digital databases. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies across institutions worldwide. The Eridu Genesis is housed at the University of Pennsylvania. Foundation deposits from Ur, Uruk, Eridu are distributed across London, Philadelphia, Baghdad, Istanbul. The textual evidence is preserved, searchable, translatable. The convergence is complete. Oral memory transmitted across 280 generations described a place archaeology confirmed existed exactly as remembered. Stone pillars, animal carvings, ritual enclosures, deliberate burial. Ur-Nanshe died 4,900 years ago, preserving knowledge from 7,000 years before his time. The pillars still stand beneath protective fill, waiting for excavation. The tablets still exist in archives, waiting for anyone willing to read what the last witnesses recorded. Archives don't forget, neither do stones. The memory chain isn't broken. It's preserved in limestone at Göbekli Tepe and clay in museum collections. The same story told twice across 7 millennia. Waiting in earth and archives for anyone willing to see what Sumer remembered and archaeology confirmed. The first temples preceded the first cities. The gods gathered before kingship descended, and the knowledge, when it mattered most, was buried to survive.